At the beginning of John's Gospel, we read, "In Jesus was the divine life, and that his life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." On Good Friday, it certainly seemed like God's light had been extinguished for good. But 3 days later, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, John reports that an empty tomb was witnessed by Peter and someone he refers to as the other disciple, possibly John himself. They didn't really understand what this meant, and so went home. Our Gospel reading today relates John's account of what happened later that evening. The grieving followers of Jesus met together in a secure place because they were afraid the authorities might be seeking to arrest them. There are a lot of people shut in their own homes right now who are afraid for different reasons. Not only are we afraid of getting COVID-19, we fear for our family members and loved ones, for our jobs, and for the state of the global economy. Like for the disciples and for John's readers, the root of this fear is an uncertain future. And just like for us today, they were also confused because they didn't know who to believe. In their case, Mary Magdalene had earlier come to the disciples exclaiming, "I have seen the Lord," and told them what the risen Jesus had said to her. It would seem that they didn't believe Mary's news. In the midst of this anxiety and confusion, we're told Jesus came and stood among them. If the stone could not keep Jesus in the tomb, why should we think a closed door would keep him from out of the room? Jesus then says the usual word of greeting that were powerfully appropriate in this moment. Peace be with you. Who needs to hear those words of Christ today? John doesn't tell us their initial reaction, but my guess is they were even more perplexed and alarmed. He tells us that Jesus then showed them his hands and side, after which the group of followers rejoiced because they recognized it was the risen Jesus. It was their wounds, or maybe the scars, of the crucifixion on his hands and side that helped convince him that this was the Lord and not some ghost or spirit, or for that matter, an impostor. As I mentioned last Sunday when we considered Matthew's account, John also indicates the resurrected Jesus had a real body. This is the consistent message of the New Testament, though many Christians today, because of the merger of Christianity with Greek thinking in the intervening centuries, believe that life after death is purely a spiritual existence. In which case, if you think about it, our physical bodies are expendable. But that is not the biblical view, and the bodily resurrection of Jesus is a vital data point that gives us a glimpse of the future in the present, together with the many healings Jesus did, all of which would be essentially pointless if all that ultimately was important was a spiritual or non-physical existence. Indeed, if that were the case, then COVID-19, cancer, and other diseases that can result in death would ultimately win. Put another way, our physical sufferings wouldn't really matter, and there would be no rescue of God's good creation. That's one good reason why the resurrection changes everything. Before we move on, I want to pause briefly and remind you that John's readers would have recalled what Jesus told his disciples earlier in John 16, just prior to his arrest. He said, "You have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you." John now describes the disciples as rejoicing at seeing the risen Christ. At which point Jesus again says, "Peace be with you." I suggest this repeated greeting would remind both Jesus' followers and John's readers the words Jesus said earlier in John 14. "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you," said Jesus. "I do not give it to you as the world does. Do not let your hearts be distressed or lacking in courage." Later in John 16, Jesus concludes his words of encouragement to his followers, saying, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." The way John tells it, these two promises of peace and joy are fulfilled by the end of the gospel. An important basis for this blessing of peace is that it ultimately arises because the last and dreaded enemy, death itself, has been defeated in the resurrection. I hope that those who are anxious and living in fear can gain comfort from these words of Jesus and the powerful message of the resurrection. Incidentally, you might ask, why didn't the risen Jesus reveal himself publicly to everyone at this time? If you think about it, that would compel belief, and so would overrule the need for faith. It's not God's way to force us to believe in him, for God respects human freedom. Faith is always an invitation, as we will now see in the subsequent story of Thomas. Thomas wasn't there with the others on that earlier occasion. We don't know why. So it was with joy and excitement the group tells Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." Thomas, however, is not impressed. He doesn't believe it. He wants hard evidence, what we might call proof today, without which he would never believe. That's why we love Thomas, because he is the incredulous non-believer, the skeptic who hides inside every person, including believing Christians, since he resists easy answers to the hard questions of faith. How does Jesus respond to Thomas? He seeks him out. Jesus takes the initiative and invites the scrutiny, in this case for Thomas to examine his wounds. And then Jesus makes this exhortation: "Do not be unbelieving, but believing." Or, "Do not be faithless, but faithful." The word doubt is not used in the Greek. After all, you have to believe in something first before you can doubt it. What Jesus says, according to John, is this: don't continue in a state of unbelief when all the evidence demands belief. Jesus is not shaming or reprimanding Thomas. Rather, he dramatically gives Thomas what he needs for faith. In John's theology, it is unbelief that is sin, not doubt. Indeed, Jesus providing an individual what he or she needs for faith is a feature throughout John's Gospel. Just reread the encounters of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well, the healing of the man who was born blind, the raising of Lazarus, even Nicodemus, and you will see that this is indeed the case. Thomas's response to this resurrection appearance is, "My Lord and my God." Lord and God are the Greek equivalents of two Hebrew words for God. Thomas recognizes God fully revealed in Jesus. Earlier in John 14, Jesus says to Thomas, "If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." It seems Thomas didn't really understand those words until now. While his intellectual honesty may make him slow to believe, yet after this encounter with the risen Christ, Thomas makes one of the most profound acclamations of faith in the whole of the New Testament. John implicitly addresses his readers then, including you and me. He tells us Jesus' reply to Thomas. Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. You see, John's Gospel was not written for skeptics to present so-called proof of faith. No, he was likely writing to a troubled church that was being oppressed by those who were wanting Jewish Christians to be expelled from the synagogues. And many of the things that he writes was therefore to inspire his readers to maintain their faith, rather than be the means to convert others. Of course, that doesn't mean that a sympathetic non-believer, one familiar with John's language and imagery, would not be so moved or persuaded by his powerful account. Having said that, John's readers were facing opposition from devout Jews, who obviously wouldn't recognize Jesus to be the Messiah. Therefore, John stresses the identity of Jesus from the beginning to the end of his gospel, including this affirmation of faith by Thomas. And this was intended as a means of encouragement and exhortation to his readers to hold firm in their belief in the distinctiveness of Jesus. This context allows us to make sense of John's ending, where he speaks directly to his readers, saying, Now Jesus performed many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This conclusion got me to think a bit more. Many people today say they believe in God and that Jesus was a good man, even credit him as being a holy man who was wise and who had a reputation for miraculous healings. But I just don't think John presents us with that option. John's purpose in his whole gospel is for all his readers to get to the same conclusion that Thomas did, to see God fully revealed in Jesus and say, my Lord and my God. Its purpose is not merely to believe Jesus rose from the dead. Rather, the resurrection is another of John's signs to the identity of Jesus. John wants us to recognize that Jesus is simply God in human form, or God enfleshed. Just go back to the beginning of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That Jesus, who came from God's glory, has now returned to God's glory via the cross and resurrection. Put another way, I think John wants us to see, like Thomas, that Jesus is divine, as well as being the Messiah or God's chosen one. That being the case, this means that God is personally engaged in history and continues to be so by his Spirit. According to John, the risen Jesus gave the gift of the Holy Spirit in his commissioning of the church on that Easter Sunday evening. Consequently, the church's life is intimately bound to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. In celebrating the resurrection, we're also therefore celebrating the beginning of the church's mission to the world. And right now, the world needs to hear that message of hope, forgiveness, and peace, together with the promise of new creation. Whatever the new normal will be after this COVID crisis recedes, it will be an exciting opportunity for the church, empowered by the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead, to again model, at least in part, what the new creation means as we embody Christ's love, forgiveness, and peace together as a vibrant community of his faithful followers. In conclusion, people have all kinds of doubts, even unbelief about God these days. Why doesn't God do more? Why doesn't God do something? Both questions arise out of human suffering. God has done something. He came in the person of Jesus, to reveal himself to us, and we killed him. Darkness doesn't like the light. But thankfully, that is not the last word, because God raised Jesus from the dead to die no more, and conclusively overcame evil's power through suffering love. This is not necessarily the response to our questions that we might want, but it is decisive action, and with the help of God's Spirit of truth, we can have our eyes open to that illuminating light as we continue to figure out what it all means in practice for us today. Whatever that might be, we can know one thing for sure. Darkness still doesn't like the light. Even so, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. Amen for that. Peace be with you. Let us pray.